When most people hear the phrase soul food, their minds leap instantly to a few staples. Golden fried chicken, gooey mac and cheese, maybe a plate of ribs heavy with sauce. That shorthand version of the cuisine has been repeated so often in media, restaurant menus, and casual conversation that it almost feels definitive. But the truth is far more layered, far more intricate. Soul food is not a menu of it, is a language, a living archive of memory, resistance, and survival. Every dish carries a story, often untold, always felt. These foods did not begin in abundance or indulgence. They began in the fields, in the cabins, in the smoke-filled kitchens of those who had to turn the least into the most. They began in scarcity, in the places where scraps and cast-offs were not a disappointment but a starting point. To speak of African American foodways is to speak of history in disguise, stories kneaded into dough, prayers simmered into broth, resilience fried crisp in hot oil. Think about it. What is a pot of greens, left to simmer all day with a ham hock or a smoked turkey neck, if not a meditation on transformation? The leaves were tough, bitter, almost inedible, without coaxing. The meat was often what no one else wanted, the parts discarded after the more desirable cuts were claimed. And yet, with time and patience, the pot became abundance. A broth so rich it was called pot liquor, revered as medicine, nourishment, and even symbol. That is soul food's essence. It is the alchemy of making survival taste like celebration. This is why food memory is different in Black America. For many, food is simply nourishment, a backdrop to daily life. But for descendants of enslaved Africans, food became a carrier of memory in ways books or monuments could not. Recipes were passed down in whispers, in gestures, in measurements not of cups and spoons, but of feel and sight. Pour until the ancestors say stop. Cooking was a way of remembering people whose names the record books never bothered to keep, of preserving traditions that could have been erased. Food is not just memory, it is also freedom. To sit at a table of fried fish, collards, cornbread, and pie is to sit in defiance of every system that once tried to make sure such joy could not exist. Every Sunday dinner, every holiday spread, every backyard cookout is a form of testimony. We are still here, we are still cooking, we are still passing it on. And yet, the world often misunderstands this food. It gets flattened into comfort food, stripped of its historical weight. It gets exoticized, praised for its flavor, but divorced from the struggle that made that flavor necessary. To truly understand soul food is to understand it as both joy and sorrow, both heritage and adaptation. It is to know that chitlins were not chosen but survived, that oxtails were once the refuse of the butcher's block, that cornbread was born of cornmeal rations mixed with ingenuity. But here's the miracle. None of that struggle stopped people from creating beauty. The genius of African American cooks was in refusing to let circumstance define flavor. Instead, they defined flavor themselves. They took what was given and made it their own. In their hands, scraps became sacred. In their kitchens, survival became art. To talk about soul food, then, is not just to talk about recipes. It is to talk about migrations, about how foodways carried from West Africa transformed on American soil, how the Great Migration brought collards and cornbread north, how Sunday dinners in Mississippi echoed in Chicago kitchens decades later. It is to talk about spirituality, how food served as blessing, how meals marked both birth and burial, joy and grief. And it is to talk about identity, how the taste of molasses gingerbread or the smell of catfish frying in cornmeal batter could transport someone instantly back to their grandmother's kitchen. Food has always been our first archive. Before we could write our names, before we could claim our stories in public, we knew them in taste. The tang of vinegar on collards, the sweetness of candied yams, the earthy depth of lima beans cooked down with smoked meat. These were history lessons long before they were restaurant dishes. That is why we must approach these recipes not as quaint traditions or soulful flavors, but as cultural documents. They are blueprints of survival, each one a testimony that says, we lived, we endured, we found joy anyway. When you taste smothered pork chops, or hoe cakes, or a slice of sweet potato pie, you are tasting centuries of memory condensed into a bite. This journey through recipes, rituals, and remembrances is not just about food. It is about how food held us together when everything else threatened to tear us apart. It is about how kitchens became classrooms, how tables became sanctuaries, how passing a plate was sometimes the only inheritance we had to give. So let us set the table. Let us open the pot and lift the lid. Let us smell the smoke, taste the sweetness, and honor the hands that stirred before ours. Soul food is not nostalgia. It is testimony. It is resistance on a plate. It is memory you can chew. And this story begins, as it always does, in the skillet. The kitchen hums differently when pork chops are on the menu. The skillet grows hotter, the anticipation thicker, and every sound from the sizzle of meat hitting oil to the scrape of a spoon against cast iron feels like part of a performance. Smothered pork chops are not just dinner. They are memory, improvisation, and artistry layered in gravy. The story of pork chops in African American kitchens begins in paradox. Pork itself was always present, but rarely in the ways people imagine. For enslaved Africans, the prized cuts, tenderloin, ribs, roasts were claimed by the enslavers. What filtered down were the unwanted parts: the feet, the hocks, the intestines, the head. But every so often, a chop, thin and small, might appear, and when it did, it was treated like a gift. The skillet turned those cuts into treasure. That reverence didn't fade in later generations. In the Jim Crow South, pork chops were both affordable and symbolic. A pack of chops could stretch across several mouths, and with gravy poured heavy, a family might feel abundance even in scarcity. The skillet was the stage where that alchemy unfolded. Picture it: the cook, usually a mother or grandmother, seasoned the chops not with recipes written in books, but with muscle memory. A pinch of salt, a dusting of pepper, a whisper of paprika, maybe a dip in flour. No timers ticked on countertops. Time was measured by sound and smell. The first sear had to be quick enough to lock in juice, but not so long that it burned. That was a skill passed down hand to hand, eye to eye, kitchen to kitchen. Once browned, the real magic began. The skillet was never emptied. Every scrap of flavor, the browned bits clinging to the bottom, the sizzling fat was sacred. Into that went onions, sliced thin, collapsing into sweetness as they mingled with the drippings. Flour followed, not carefully sifted but tossed in with confidence, stirred until it transformed from paste to roux. Then came liquid water, stock, or even just whatever was on hand to loosen it into a gravy. The chops returned, now bathed, smothered, made tender by patience. Smothering was more than cooking, it was philosophy. To smother a pork chop was to insist that even the tough and overlooked could be softened, coaxed into generosity. That was a metaphor not lost on the people who cooked it. Life had been tough, bitter, unyielding. But given time, patience, and seasoning, it could be transformed. Around the table, smothered pork chops were proof of care. Children tore at biscuits, dragging them through gravy as if to claim every ounce of flavor. Adults leaned back, heavy with fullness, grateful for a moment when hunger wasn't the loudest voice in the room. The meal carried more than taste, it carried relief. During the Great Migration, when millions of black Southerners moved north and west in search of better lives, smothered pork chops traveled with them. In Chicago, Detroit, Oakland, Harlem, kitchens echoed with the same sizzle, the same gravy bubbling low. Even when the context changed, the city tenements instead of rural shacks, factory jobs instead of sharecropping, the skillet told a familiar story. You could take people out of the South, but you could not take the smothered chop out of the people. There is something profoundly communal about a dish like this. Unlike a steak, solitary and individual, pork chops smothered in gravy begged to be shared. The gravy stretched, the chops multiplied their meaning. It was a dish designed to sit in the middle of the table, daring everyone to reach in, that at everyone leaning toward the same pot, breaking bread from the same plate was its own kind of ritual, and yet, outside the community, the dish was often invisible. Cookbooks, published in the mid-20th century, celebrated French sauces and Midwestern casseroles, but the art of smothering rarely made the page. That is how cultural erasure works. The brilliance of black kitchens was lived, not written, tasted, not archived. The knowledge stayed in the smoke of kitchens, in the flick of a wrist with a spoon, in the whispered instructions. Cook it until it smells right. To smother pork chops is also to understand restraint. The dish doesn't require extravagance. It thrives on the ordinary, on onions, flour, water, patience. That is what makes it genius. Too often, survival cuisine is dismissed as simple, but simplicity is not a lack. It is a discipline. It is knowing how to pull depth from little smothered pork chops are an act of culinary resistance against waste, against invisibility, against the lie that abundance only comes from wealth. The smell alone tells the story. The onions sweet and sharp, the pork savory and heavy, the gravy rich with fat and flour, it all clings to the air long after the skillet is washed. In neighborhoods where windows were left open, one house cooking smothered chops could perfume an entire block, and neighbors knew that smell meant somebody's table was full tonight. For children, the memory of smothered chops was not just in taste, but in sound, the hiss of oil, the scrape of a spoon, the soft bubbling of gravy. For adults, it was the memory of watching a parent or grandparent labor at the stove, apron tied, face glistening, determined to feed a family. For elders, it was proof that nothing was wasted, that every cut had value. Today, when chefs reinvent or reimagine soul food, smothered pork chops still return. They appear in restaurants dressed up with wine reductions or artisanal cuts. But the essence doesn't live in fine dining. It lives in cast iron skillets, passed down through generations, in kitchens where measurements are guesses and time is intuition. It lives in the way gravy thickens, without a whisk, just a fork and persistence. At its heart, the smothered pork chop is not about the chop at all. It is about the smothering. It is about the act of taking something tough, overlooked, undervalued, and refusing to let it stay that way. It is about insisting that tenderness can be coaxed out of hardness, that patience can turn scarcity into plenty. It is about survival dressed as comfort. When the last chop is eaten, when the last biscuit has mopped up the last smear of gravy, what remains is memory. Not just of flavor, but of what flavor represents. The creativity, resilience, and love of a people who never let circumstance define their joy. And so, the skillet cools, but the story remains. Smothered pork chops are not simply food. They are inheritance, one bite carrying centuries of endurance and transformation. If you listen closely, collard greens have their own rhythm. They rustle when washed, whisper when chopped, and sigh as they simmer slowly in a heavy pot. Their sympathy, sharp and smoky, when paired with meat creeps through walls, seeping into curtains, into clothes, into memory itself. Collard greens are more than a side dish. They are a ritual, a declaration, and a reminder of where we've been. Collards trace their lineage back thousands of years to the fields of West Africa, where leafy greens were central to daily meals. In African kitchens, greens were simmered into stews, enriched with palm oil, seasoned with spices that turned humble leaves into nourishment that felt expansive. When enslaved Africans were forced across the Atlantic, they carried not recipes on paper, but memories of flavors, methods, rhythms of cooking. The American South did not have the same plants, no cassava leaves, no bitter leaf bud. It had collards, mustard, turnip greens. These became substitutes, and over time, sacred. Collard greens became a kind of freedom food, but not in the way outsiders might expect. Freedom was not in the ingredients themselves. They were cheap, often grown in small backyard plots or received as rations. Freedom was in the act of claiming them. Enslaved people had little control over their lives, but they could cultivate greens in hidden corners of gardens. They could season them their way. They could simmer them slowly when the day's work was finally done. That small act of choice, of autonomy, carried profound weight. And then there was the pot liquor, the deeply flavored broth left after hours of simmering greens with smoked meat. High in vitamins and minerals, it was survival in liquid form. Children were often given cups of it when other food was scarce. Elders drank it as medicine. Calling it liquor was no accident. It had potency, spirit, depth. To this day, many Southerners insist that pot liquor is the best part, the essence of the greens themselves. Collards also became entangled with spiritual meaning. In African cosmologies, greens often symbolized renewal, fertility, the cycles of life. In the Black American South, collards came to signify prosperity. Eating them on New Year's Day, alongside black-eyed peas, became a ritual. The greens represented money, the peas, coins, cornbread, gold. To begin the year with a plate of them was to declare hope in abundance, even when pockets were empty. The ritual survives because it was never just about superstition. It was about faith in the future, rooted in food. Cooking collards is an act of patience. They resist quick fixes. Drop them raw on a plate, and they are tough, bitter, unyielding. But cook them low and slow, and they transform. The bitterness softens, the leaves surrender, the broth deepens. That transformation carries metaphor. To sit with something difficult, to give it time, to coax out its generosity, this was a lesson in survival. The very method of cooking collards mirrored the resilience of the people who tended them. For many families, Sunday dinner wasn't complete without a pot of greens on the stove. They anchored the meal, balancing heavier foods like fried chicken or pork chops with their deep, savory presence. But greens were never just a side. They were the dish people checked first when the lids were lifted. The one that perfumed the house, the one that lingered in memory. Children might complain about their bitterness, pushing them around plates. But as they grew older, they learned what those greens meant. Nourishment, history, care. During the Great Migration, collards traveled to packed in baskets on trains, replanted in northern yards, carried into kitchens in Detroit, Chicago, and Harlem. They became a link back home. For migrants facing the alienation of new cities, a pot of collards simmering on the stove recreated a sense of rootedness. It didn't matter if the skyline outside the window was concrete instead of pine trees. Inside, the air smelled like the South. There's also something communal about greens. Washing and chopping them was often a family affair. a task that could take hours depending on how big the pot. Hands moved, rhythmically snap, tear, drop while conversations flowed. Gossip, advice, stories, songs. The kitchen became a gathering space. The greens, a reason to linger together. Even now, in many black households, preparing greens is not an isolated task, but a shared one. Outsiders have often misunderstood collards, dismissing them as peasant food, too pungent, too messy, too humble. Yet, in recent years, they've appeared on Findening menus, dressed up with cream or exotic spices, stripped of their cultural weight, but their essence resists erasure. Collards belong to the people who tended them when no one else wanted them, who turned them into symbols of survival and prosperity. They carry that history in every bite. The memory of collards is not just taste, but sound and smell. The bubbling pot, the hiss of steam escaping the lid, the faint smokiness of ham, hocks, or turkey necks mingling with earth. The smell clings, and for many, it is inseparable from childhood itself, the scent that meant a holiday was near, or that Sunday dinner was almost ready. Memory doesn't fade when it's cooked into the air. Today, collards remain central to soul food, not just because they taste good, but because they remind us of who we are. They remind us that freedom isn't always grand or dramatic. Sometimes it looks like tending a garden plot behind a cabin. Sometimes it looks like stirring a pot slowly, claiming time as your own. Sometimes it looks like feeding your children broth rich enough to carry them through another day. To eat collard greens is to eat history, resilience, and hope. It is to taste the ingenuity of people who refused to let bitterness win, who coaxed sweetness and depth from what others dismissed. It is to sit at a table where freedom was always partial, always deferred, yet somehow always tasted. So when the pot lid lifts and the steam hits your face, know this: you are breathing in more than greens. You are breathing in centuries of survival and faith. Collard greens are not just food, they are testimony. They are breath. They are freedom simmered down until it fills your spoon. Few foods speak with the quiet authority of cornbread. Golden, fragrant, and humble. It arrives at the table, not with fanfare, but with presence. A pan of cornbread, cut into squares or wedges, is never just starch to soak up juice. It is invitation, community, and memory baked in cast iron. Corn itself was here long before Europeans or Africans set foot in the Americas. Indigenous peoples cultivated it, revered it, and transformed it into countless forms: ash cakes, pone, hominy, grits. It was sustenance and ceremony. Earth turned into nourishment. When enslaved Africans entered the brutal world of plantations, they encountered corn as both ration and possibility. Wheat flour was rare and precious, but cornmeal was plentiful, cheap, filling. From it, new traditions emerged, blending African memory with native wisdom and the constraints of survival. Cornbread became the daily bread of the South. It was quick to make, requiring little more than meal, water, and salt. Sometimes leavened, sometimes not. Sometimes enriched with buttermilk, eggs, or lard, if the household could spare it. Sometimes plain and hard, a journey cake meant to travel. It was flexible, adaptable, able to fit into the lives of people who had little choice over anything else. But in black kitchens, cornbread was more than sustenance. It was the thing that brought the meal together. It sat beside collard greens to soak up pot liquor, beside beans to make them stretch, beside pork chops to mop up gravy. It was the bridge between dishes, the way flavors touched, that role always connecting, always present, mirrored the way it functioned socially. To break bread was to be in community. To share cornbread was to share belonging. The vessel mattered. To cornbread, made in a cast iron skillet, carried a crust no other pan could match: dark, crisp, almost smoky. Many families guarded their skillets like heirlooms, seasoning them through decades of meals, until they seemed to whisper with memory. Some Castilian pans, passed down through generations, became more than tools. They became archives, carrying the oils and flavors of ancestors. In that sense, cornbread was never just about what went into the pan, it was about the pan itself, seasoned with time. Cornbread also carried symbolism in the ritual of sharing. Unlike biscuits, which could be hoarded individually, cornbread was baked communal. One pan, one knife, everyone reaching toward the same dish. That mattered in households where division was already a fact of life, division between master and enslaved, between rich and poor. At the black table, cornbread symbolized a different kind of economy, one built on sharing. There were variations, of course. Some families sweetened it, especially in the north, where sugar and molasses became more common. Others insisted true cornbread should never be sweet. Some crumbled it into buttermilk, making a tangy porridge. Others broke it into greens, letting it dissolve into the broth. However it was eaten, the principle was the same. Cornbread was not just a side dish. It was a medium for communion, both literal and spiritual. During the civil rights movement, cornbread traveled in lunch bags and church kitchens. It sustained activists on long marches and long nights of planning. Its portabilities to carry, slow to spoil, made it practical. But its symbolism carried to pack cornbread for a journey was to pack a reminder of home, of care, of the community waiting at the end of struggle. Cornbread was also a reminder of poverty, of course. For many, it was what you ate when there wasn't much else. But rather than being a mark of shame, it became a mark of resilience. To take what was available, cornmeal, water, a little fat, and make it satisfying, was a kind of culinary defiance. It said, "We will eat, we will gather, we will live." Memory clings to cornbread. The smell of it, baking warm, nutty, slightly sweet, pulls people back to kitchens long gone. The sight of butter melting into its crumb recalls the tables of grandparents, the laughter of siblings, the hum of conversation. Even when eaten in restaurants or read about in cookbooks, cornbread carries an echo of intimacy. It belongs not just to history, but to the senses. Cornbread also symbolizes the blending of cultures that birthed soul food. Indigenous people brought the corn. Africans brought methods of leavening, frying, and improvising. Europeans brought iron pans and ovens. Out of that collision came a dish that none could claim alone, but that black kitchens made central, infusing it with meaning. In the ritual of Sunday dinners, cornbread is often the first dish to leave the table. Children grab it eagerly, elders crumble it with precision. Everyone reaches for it almost without thinking. Its disappearance is a kind of compliment. It means the meal has coherence, that the flavors have found their anchor. In its quiet way, cornbread affirms the table's purpose, to feed body and spirit alike. Even today, when food trends rise and fall, cornbread resists disappearance. It appears in high-end restaurants, dressed with honey butter, or alongside barbecue on paper plates, or in Castilian pans on holiday tables. However it arrives, its essence is unchanged. Cornbread remains what it has always been: humble, generous, binding. To speak of cornbread is to speak of more than cornmeal. It is to speak of history, indigenous, African, American, interwoven in one dish. It is to speak of survival, of making much from little. It is to speak of the table as a place of belonging. When we break cornbread, we don't just feed ourselves. We honor the people who found a way to eat when there seemed no way. We echo the hands that stirred, baked, and passed it down. We join a lineage of resilience. Cornbread is more than bread. It is story. It is memory. It is the sound of a knife scraping against a skillet. The sight of steam rising from a golden wedge. The taste of community itself. If collard greens are earth and cornbread is hearth, then candied yams are pure sunlight on the table. Their orange glow catches the eye before anything else. Their scent syrupy, spiced caramel sweet rises from the dish like a promise. At once rich and playful, candied yams carry a different energy. They are dessert disguised as dinner, a burst of joy in the middle of a savory spread. But first, a truth. Most of what we call yams in the United States are not true yams at all. Real yams are starchy tubers, rough-skinned, and native to Africa and Asia. What sits on soul food tables are sweet potatoes, native to the Americas, adopted by Africans in the diaspora, and renamed yams in a gesture of both memory and adaptation. The name stuck, and with it came layers of meaning. Sweet potatoes were among the crops enslaved Africans encountered in the New World that echoed home. While not identical to African yams, their sweet flesh and versatility offered familiarity. Like corn, they were abundant and filling. Enslaved cooks transformed them into pies, fritters, and, eventually, candied dishes that bridged continents in taste and spirit. Calling them yams was more than mislabeling it, was a way of carrying Africa forward in language, even when the land itself was lost. Candied yams became a fixture of holiday tables, especially Thanksgiving and Christmas. They were never just a side. They were the signal that celebration was at hand. Ordinary meals rarely had the luxury of sugar, butter, and spices all at once. But on special days, families pulled out the stops. A pan of yams, glazed until sticky and glistening, symbolized abundance, love, and care. They were the food that turned dinner into feast. Cooking candied yams requires patience and attention. The sweet potatoes must be peeled, sliced evenly, and nestled in a pan. Then comes the alchemy. Brown sugar, butter, cinnamon, nutmeg, maybe a splash of vanilla or a drizzle of syrup. Some cooks keep it simple, others layer on spice and citrus zest. As the pan bakes, the sugar melts, the butter soaks in, the slices soften, edges caramelize. The line between vegetable and candy blurs. What emerges is not simply cooked sweet potato, it's transformation. In that transformation lies metaphor. Candied yams remind us that sweetness can come from roots, from things pulled from the dirt. They teach that beauty is not the absence of hardship, but the result of fire and patience. To eat them is to taste possibility, the way the bitter can be turned, with care, into something celebratory. For Black families, candied yams also became an expression of hospitality. Guests at the table were always offered them, not just as food, but as honor. The dish represented generosity. To share something sweet when sweetness was rare was to say, "You matter, you are welcome here." In communities marked by scarcity, that gesture carried profound weight. The relationship between yams and memory is especially strong. For many, the sight of that bubbling orange dish calls back instantly to childhood holidays, grandmothers humming in the kitchen, cousins sneaking tastes with spoons, elders insisting, "Save room for the yams." Each family had its signature version. Some used marshmallows browned on top. Others swore that was sacrilege. Some insisted on molasses. Others trusted only brown sugar. Yet all agreed. The yams had to be there. Without them, the table felt incomplete. There is also a deeper symbolism at play. In African traditions, sweetness often marked sacredness. Honey, fruit, or syrup was used in rituals to honor gods, ancestors, and children. To bring sweetness into a meal was to invite blessing. Candied yams, in their festive glow, carry echoes of that spiritual function. They are not just indulgence. They are offering. Candied yams traveled with the Great Migration, carrying the holidays of the South into northern kitchens. In cities like Chicago or Detroit, they became anchors of continuity. No matter how industrial the surroundings, a pan of yams on the table transformed the space into a place of heritage. They were a way of saying, we remember who we are, even here. The sensory memory is unmistakable. The forks sinking into tender slices, the syrup pooling on the plate, mingling with cornbread crumbs, the way the sweetness lingers on the tongue, balancing the savory depth of greens or the saltiness of ham. A meal with candied yams is a meal with contrast, balance, harmony. They are the pause in the song, the bright note in a minor key. Candied yams also speak to the artistry of black cooking. To elevate something simple into something layered, beautiful, and celebratory, that is art. Soul food has always been about more than survival. It is about imagination, about transforming what was available into what was memorable. Yams show that truth in its sweetest form. Even now, candied yams resist being reduced to trend or novelty. They appear on modern menus, dressed with exotic spices or deconstructed into fine dining shapes. But their soul remains in the family pan, passed around a crowded table, steaming and shining. That is where they belong, at the center of community, memory, and joy. To eat candied yams is to participate in centuries of resilience and celebration. It is to honor ancestors who renamed a root and made it sacred. It is to remember that sweetness is not frivolous, but essential, that in bitter lives, joy must also be claimed. Candied yams are not just food. They are reminder. They are song. They are the glow of the sun brought indoors, captured in a pan, shared with everyone who comes to the table. Few dishes shine as brightly on the soul food table as macaroni and cheese. Golden, bubbling, rich with melted cheese. It arrives almost regal and indulgence, a centerpiece, a crowd pleaser. Children run to it first, adults linger over it longest, and plates rarely leave the table without a scoop of its creamy weight. Yet beneath that comforting glow lies a complex story of luxury and longing, of invention and adaptation, of a struggle to claim abundance in a world that often denied it. Macaroni and cheese did not begin in black kitchens. Its roots stretch back to Europasta and cheese. Dishes appear in Italian and English cookbooks as early as the 14th century. Thomas Jefferson, after visiting Paris and encountering pasta dishes abroad, is often credited with popularizing macaroni and cheese in America. He even imported a pasta machine. But what Jefferson brought back as delicacy, his enslaved chef, James Hemings, transformed with skill and labor. It was Hemings, trained in French cuisine, who cooked those first American versions, proof that even in its earliest appearances, mac and cheese bore the imprint of black hands. Over time, what began as elite fare trickled into wider culture. Pasta became cheaper, cheese more accessible. In white households, baked macaroni and cheese often remained a dish for gatherings, a sign of refinement. In black households, it evolved differently, shaped by both scarcity and aspiration. For enslaved and later impoverished black families, cheese was expensive, milk not always available, ovens not always present. Macaroni, when it could be afforded, was often stretched with milk, margarine, or even water. Sometimes Velveeta or government-issued cheese became the cornerstone, turning survival into sustenance. That tension between luxury and survival has always defined mac and cheese in the black tradition. On ordinary days, it was absent, too costly for daily fare. But on holidays, Sunday dinners, and special occasions, it became essential. A pan of baked macaroni and cheese on the table was a declaration. We have made it to celebration. It was edible proof that even when the world gave little, families found a way to offer plenty. The preparation itself speaks volumes. Unlike stovetop versions, the soul food tradition often insists on baking. Elbows are boiled, layered, or stirred with cheese, sometimes eggs, sometimes evaporated milk, then placed in a dish to bake until the top crust browns and bubbles. That crust is more than texture, it is symbol. It is transformation through heat. A humble collection of ingredients turned into something golden, abundant, whole. Every family has its secrets. Sharp cheddar only, or a mix with mozzarella. Breadcrumbs on top, or never. Eggs for firmness, or none for creaminess. Some insist on Velveeta for smoothness, others reject it as inauthentic. These debates, sometimes heated, reveal something deeper. Mac and cheese is not just food, it is identity. How you make it says something about where you come from, who taught you, what resources you had. Macaroni and cheese also carries the weight of performance. On holidays, the cook responsible for it bears pressure, everyone watching, waiting to see if the dish came out right. A runny or bland pan can disappoint an entire gathering. A perfect one can anchor the meal. The responsibility is heavy because the dish itself holds symbolic weight. It is not just side dish, it is centerpiece, proof of care and craft. Children often claim mac and cheese as their dish, piling it high, grinning as cheese strings stretch from fork to plate. But elders savor it too, remembering leaner times, feeling in its richness a kind of victory. Each bite becomes layered. Childhood delight, ancestral labor, communal pride. In the story of soul food, mac and cheese embodies aspiration. It is the taste of what once seemed unattainable: cheese, milk, pastel, gathered in one place. To place it on the table is to refuse the narrative of deprivation. It says, we deserve richness too. It transforms what was once reserved for elites into everyday black abundance. During the Great Migration, macaroni and cheese traveled north, becoming a holiday staple in new urban kitchens. Even in cramped apartments with little more than a gas oven, families made space for a pan of golden pasta. It became a link between past and present, south and north, struggle and progress. The sight of mac and cheese in a northern kitchen whispered, we carried our traditions with us, and we made them shine even here. It is also a dish of memory. Ask any black child about holiday meals, and mac and cheese will surface first. The bubbling dish pulled from the oven, the smell of sharp cheddar filling the house, the way cousins raced to get the first scoop. For many, it is not Christmas or Thanksgiving without it. Its absence feels like loss. Its presence feels like home. Today, mac and cheese straddles worlds. On one hand, it is mass-produced, boxed, marketed as quick comfort. On the other, it remains sacred in soul food kitchens, guarded by recipes that resist shortcuts. Both realities exist, but the latter preserves what the dish has always meant: care, patience, celebration. The golden crust of baked macaroni and cheese holds more than melted cheddar. It holds centuries of adaptation, the tension between want and plenty, the insistence on joy even in hardship. It is a dish that began as luxury, endured as survival, and persists as symbol of abundance. To eat mac and cheese at the soul food table is to eat history, Jefferson and Hemmings. The scarcity of sharecropping kitchens, the laughter of holiday gatherings, the resilience of migration. It is to taste survival gilded with aspiration. Macaroni and cheese, in the end, is not just golden pasta. It is golden story. It is the taste of triumph, of black creativity turning scarcity into richness, denial into celebration. It is the dish that tells us, joy is not optional, it is necessary and we will bake it, serve it, and savor it together. On New Year's Day, countless black families across America gather around bowls of black-eyed peas. Tender, earthy, often simmered with smoked meat, they are eaten not only for nourishment but for luck. Eat your peas, elders insist, and you'll have good fortune all year long. The ritual is so ingrained that for many, the year feels incomplete without it. But these humble legumes carry far more than superstition. They carry the weight of survival, remembrance, and resilience. Black-eyed peas trace their origins to West Africa, where they have been cultivated for thousands of years. They crossed the Atlantic on slave ships, tucked into provisions, or deliberately brought along by enslaved Africans who carried seeds from home. In the brutal rupture of slavery, black-eyed peas became one of the few direct agricultural links between Africa and the Americas. They were not just food, but continuities, something familiar in a world intent on erasure. On plantations, black-eyed peas were often relegated to the diets of enslaved people, dismissed by owners as coarse or fit only for livestock. Yet from those dismissals came invention. With skill and necessity, cooks transformed them into stews, fritters, and savory sides that sustained bodies through long hours of labor. They became part of a hidden tradition, food of the oppressed, elevated through creativity into nourishment that carried both memory and meaning. The association with luck, especially at New Year's, has roots in multiple histories. One strand reaches back to Africa, where legumes symbolized fertility, prosperity, and continuity of life. Another emerges from the Civil War. In 1865, as Sherman's army marched through the South, they burned crops but often left behind black-eyed peas, considered animal fodder. For many newly freed people, peas became the food that prevented starvation. Eating them at the start of the year was not symbolic, it was survival. Over time, survival transformed into ritual, and ritual became tradition. Today, black-eyed peas are rarely served alone on New Year's. They are almost always paired with green scallops, mustard, or turnip. Together, they carry layered symbolism. Peas for coins, greens for paper money, cornbread for gold. A meal of these dishes is a wish, a prayer made edible, prosperity, abundance, stability. To eat them is to declare hope for the year ahead. But the meaning runs deeper than luck. To eat black-eyed peas on New Year's is also to honor ancestors who endured hunger and hardship, yet carved ritual from necessity. It is to carry forward their resilience in a new time. Each spoonful is layered with memory of Africa, of slavery, of emancipation, of migration. Few dishes hold history so densely in so small a form. The preparation of black-eyed peas varies from family to family. Some simmer them slowly with smoked turkey or ham hocks, letting the meat infuse the pot with savor. Others keep them vegetarian, seasoned with onions, garlic, and peppers. In the Low Country, peas are transformed into Hoppin' John, a dish of peas and rice, often flavored with bacon or salt pork. Each version tells a story of place, adaptation, and available resources. Yet all share the same essence. Humble ingredients elevated by time and care into something more than sustenance. The act of eating them together also matters. New Year's meals with black-eyed peas are communal affairs, often sprawling with cousins, neighbors, and friends. Elders pass down stories along with servings, reminding the younger generation of why the dish matters. Children may roll their eyes at talk of luck, but they eat anyway, learning through ritual what words alone cannot teach. That food binds us to history, to community, to hope. Black-eyed peas also revealed the rhythm of continuity in soul food. Unlike candied yams or mac and cheese, which shine during holidays, peas mark the turning of time itself. They are a food of cycles of years, beginning and ending, of remembering the past while facing the future. In their small, round form, they even resemble seeds, coins, or eye symbols of watching, of guarding, of seeing what lies ahead. For many African Americans, the first spoonful of peas on January 1st is as sacred as a prayer. It is an embodied ritual, not just an intellectual one. Through taste, texture, and tradition, people ground themselves in a lineage that stretches across oceans and centuries. The dish says, "We are still here, still beginning again, still claiming hope against all odds." In cities across the country, from Atlanta to Chicago to Los Angeles, black-eyed peas connect dispersed families to a shared past. They are as present in northern apartments as in southern farmhouses, as essential in urban kitchens as in rural ones. Wherever they appear, they transform space into memory. The pot bubbling on the stove whispers, "This is not just a meal, this is a covenant." And always, there is the reminder of contrast. For generations, black-eyed peas were food of the poor, dismissed and overlooked. Yet today they stand proudly at the center of celebration, claimed as tradition, honored as inheritance. That reversal carries symbolic power. What was once sign of deprivation becomes emblem of resilience. To serve black-eyed peas at the new year is to invert the narrative, to proclaim that what sustained us in struggle now blesses us in celebration. The story of black-eyed peas is not glamorous. They are small, plain, and easily overlooked. Yet they carry within them the essence of soul food itself. Transformation, resilience, and continuity. They remind us that survival itself is luck, that memory itself is fortune, that hope itself is abundance. To eat black-eyed peas on New Year's Day is to taste more than legumes. It is to taste Africa carried across oceans. It is to taste the ingenuity of enslaved cooks. It is to taste survival after war and hunger. It is to taste the collective hope of a people who turned scarcity into symbol, necessity into ritual. Black-eyed peas are not just for good luck. They are luck, the luck of endurance, the luck of community, the luck of hope that refuses to die. Each bowl holds more than food. It holds the turning of time, the persistence of memory, and the promise that joy, like peas in a pot, multiplies when shared. Every soul food meal is more than a spread of dishes, it is an archive. Each pan of cornbread, each pot of greens, each slice of sweet potato pie holds memories, lessons, and histories too vast to be written in books alone. Around the table, families preserve what official records often erase. Recipes are not just instructions. They are oral histories, testimonies, acts of survival, and celebration passed hand to hand, plate to plate, generation to generation. For centuries, the written histories of black people in America were suppressed, distorted, or ignored. Enslaved people were denied literacy. Their voices were systematically silenced. But memory found refuge in food. A grandmother's way of seasoning beans, an uncle's secret for crisping chicken, a mother's rule that macaroni and cheese must always be baked. These became unwritten texts. Recipes lived in gestures, in memory, in repetition. In kitchens where paper and ink were absent, food became the medium of remembrance. The family table, then, is a kind of library. Each dish, carefully prepared, carries the story of those who came before. Greens recall the gardens of enslaved ancestors, where collards and mustards grew in small patches of reclaimed land. Cornbread whispers of native traditions blended with African ones, sustaining people who made abundance out of grain and water. Sweet potato pie echoes fields and kitchens where harvest was both toil and celebration. The table gathers them all, creating an edible archive too intimate to be lost. But the feast does more than preserve, it teaches. Children learn their history not only through stories told, but through meals shared. A grandmother may not recite dates or names, but when she insists on black-eyed peas every New Year's, she teaches continuity. When an aunt tells a child to taste this and tell me if it's right, she is passing down skill and responsibility. Cooking becomes pedagogy, and eating becomes initiation. To take part in the feast is to inherit history, not abstractly, but with mouth and memory. The archive of the feast is also emotional. It records not only struggle, but joy. Holidays in Black households often unfold around crowded tables where laughter mixes with the aroma of food. Cousins argue, uncles tell stories, elders reminisce, children sneak tastes. The table becomes stage, classroom, sanctuary. In that gathering, families enact a form of collective resilience, affirming that despite hardship, there is still abundance, still laughter, still community. The archive preserves not just what was endured, but how joy was claimed. Migration deepened the role of the feast as archive. When millions of African Americans moved from the rural South to northern and western cities, they carried recipes with them like sacred texts. In new landscapes, cornbread and greens, yams and peas became reminders of home. Preparing them in cramped apartments or distant neighborhoods was an act of memory, a way to stay tethered to roots, even in unfamiliar soil. The family feast became both archive and anchor, linking people across geography and time. And yet, the archive of the feast is fragile. Recipes sometimes disappear when a cook passes without sharing them. Families mourn not only the person, but the loss of flavors, the silence of forgotten methods. To guard against this, many households insist on teaching younger generations to cook. "Stand here with me," an elder might say, "watch how I do it." Measurements are often approximate, a pinch of this, a handful of that, but the act of transmission matters. Cooking together ensures the archive continues. The gathering table also records adaptation. Each generation adds its own entries. A daughter might replace ham hocks with smoked turkey for health. A grandson might experiment with vegan versions of mac and cheese. Families debate these changes, sometimes fiercely, but in the end, adaptation becomes part of the record. The archive grows, flexible yet rooted. Soul food lives not because it is static, but because it evolves while carrying memory forward. Feasts mark time as well as memory. Thanksgiving, Christmas, Juneteenth, and Sunday dinners all gather people around food that signals more than hunger. They mark survival, freedom, gratitude, continuity. The table itself becomes temporal archive, inscribing not just family history, but the rhythm of life. Births, weddings, funerals, graduations, homecomings. At each event, food is present, bearing witness. In this way, the soul food table resists erasure. History books may minimize, records may vanish, but collards and cornbread on a Sunday afternoon tell a story no institution can erase. The table insists. We were here, we gathered, we celebrated, we remembered. It transforms everyday eating into ceremony, everyday recipes into testimony, and always the archive is collective. Unlike fine dining, where presentation is solitary and individualized, the soul food feast is communal. Dishes are placed in the center, served family style, passed hand to hand, No one owns the table, it belongs to everyone. This practice reflects the values carried from Africa. Food as shared inheritance, sustenance as communal responsibility. To sit at the table is to enter into community, to belong to something larger than oneself. In an era when memory often feels fragile, when families scatter, when traditions blur, the soul food feast remains vital. Each gathering is an act of archiving, preserving not just flavors but connections. Each recipe handed down is a record of continuity. Each shared meal is evidence that history, though unwritten, is alive and edible. The family table, then, is not only where we eat, it is where we remember. It is where we teach. It is where we affirm that survival was never the end of the story, that joy, abundance, and celebration are part of the record too. The feast is living proof that food is history, memory, and inheritance, carried not in books but in bodies, not in libraries but in kitchens. To sit at a soul food table is to open an archive made of flavor and love. It is to taste history made tender, to savor memory made edible. The feast tells us we are more than what was taken, more than what was denied. We are the keepers of memory, the writers of unwritten histories, the curators of a living archive that nourishes not only stomachs but spirits. The gathering table is, and has always been, our greatest library. Soul food is often spoken of with reverence, a cuisine heavy with memory, ritual, and joy. Yet, in the modern world, it is also surrounded by tension. On one hand, soul food is celebrated, recognized as central to American culinary identity, cherished in restaurants and homes alike. On the other hand, it is criticized, sometimes harshly, as unhealthy, outdated, or incompatible with contemporary concerns about wellness. Between those poles lies a complex question. How does soul food live on in a world where tradition must meet change? For many, the critique begins with health. Fried chicken, candied yams, macaroni and cheese, sweet tea, these dishes, beloved though they are, carry reputations for excess. Too much fat, too much sugar, too much salt. Medical statistics about high rates of hypertension, diabetes, and heart disease among African Americans often point to diet as culprit, with soul food singled out as suspect. The cuisine that once sustained survival is reframed in modern discourse as threat. But this critique, while not baseless, is incomplete. Soul food, in its origins, was not defined by excess, but by balance and resourcefulness. Collard greens simmered with onions and peppers, field peas cooked with herbs, sweet potatoes roasted simply, these are deeply nourishing foods. The heavy use of frying, sugar, and meat that came to dominate later was shaped by scarcity and celebration. Fried chicken, for example, was too precious for everyday meals, reserved for Sunday or special occasions. Candied yams were a holiday luxury, not daily fare. To understand soul food only through its most indulgent dishes is to miss its broader landscape. The health question, then, is not only about food, but about context. The conditions of poverty, limited access to fresh produce, and structural inequities in healthcare have shaped the ways many communities eat. Blaming soul food alone for poor health obscures the deeper forces at work. In fact, reclaiming the plant-based, vegetable-rich roots of the cuisine may offer a path toward both health and heritage. In recent years, a renaissance of innovation has emerged. Black chefs, writers, and home cooks are reimagining soul food with wellness in mind, baking instead of frying, using olive oil instead of lard, seasoning with fresh herbs instead of salt, centering vegetables as stars rather than sides. Vegan soul food has blossomed, with dishes like barbecue jackfruit sandwiches, cashew mac and cheese, or collards cooked without meat but with layers of spice and smoke. These innovations do not abandon tradition. They extend it, proving that creativity remains at the heart of the cuisine. This turn toward innovation has sparked debate about authenticity. What makes soul food soul food? Is it the ingredients, the techniques, the flavors, or is it the history, the spirit, the community that gathers around the table? For some, altering recipes risks erasure, a dilution of what ancestors carried forward. For others, adaptation is itself authentic, a continuation of the very resilience that defined soul food from the start. After all, soul food has never been static. It has always evolved, shaped by migration, circumstance, and imagination. Restaurants offer another stage where these questions play out. Across the country, soul food establishments range from small, family-run diners serving fried chicken and collards, as they always have, to upscale spots where chefs present deconstructed cornbread or smoked greens on fine china. Both claim the label of soul food, though in different registers. The coexistence of tradition and innovation reveals the expansiveness of the cuisine, its ability to live comfortably in both a grandmother's kitchen and a Michelin-starred dining room. Media, too, has reshaped perception. Television, cookbooks, and social media have given new visibility to Black chefs, who both honor and reinvent the canon. Writers like Jessica B. Harris and Michael W. Twitty remind audiences of history's weight in every bite, while contemporary cooks on Instagram share videos of kale salads alongside fried fish. The digital age has turned recipes into archives accessible across generations and continents, allowing the cuisine to travel farther than ever before. At the same time, questions of ownership and appropriation surface when non-Black chefs present soul food as novelty, or when restaurants market dishes without acknowledging their origins. The cuisine risks being commodified without context. Protecting the cultural integrity of soul food means insisting that its stories accompany its flavors, that the history of survival and creativity is not erased in the glow of commercial success. The modern moment also calls for reflection on what soul food represents beyond the plate. In a time when wellness culture often emphasizes restriction, purity, and individual health, soul food continues to remind us of joy, abundance, and community. A plate of fried chicken shared with family may not align with every health guideline, but it nourishes in ways that go beyond calories. To reduce food only to its nutritional content is to ignore its role in memory, identity, and belonging. Soul food challenges a narrow definition of health by insisting that connection, joy, and ritual are forms of nourishment too. The future of soul food, then, is not a choice between tradition and change. It is both. It is the Sunday table, heavy with collards and cornbread, and it is the vegan cafe serving jackfruit po' boys. It is the grandmother frying chicken in cast iron, and it is the young chef plating collards as haute cuisine. What binds them together is not identical flavor but shared inheritance, the lineage of resilience, creativity, and community. Perhaps the real question is not authenticity, but integrity. Does the food honor the memory it carries? Does it connect people to one another? Does it sustain both body and spirit? If the answer is yes, then it belongs to the soul food tradition. Whether simmered with ham hocks or seasoned with smoked paprika and olive oil, in the modern world, soul food continues to evolve as it always has, meeting new challenges with creativity, shaping identity through taste, holding memory in every bite. It is not frozen in the past, but alive in the present, flexible yet rooted, personal yet collective. What soul food proves, more than anything, is that authenticity is not about replication, but about spirit. It is about honoring the past while making space for the future. It is about remembering that the heart of the cuisine has never been a single dish, but the community it feeds, the history it preserves, the hope it sustains. Soul food in the modern world remains what it has always been, a mirror of Black life, struggling, adapting, thriving, creating. It holds both the weight of history and the possibility of tomorrow. To eat it today is to participate in that continuum. To taste not only what has been, but what is still being written, one plate at a time. To speak of soul food is to speak of more than flavor. It is to speak of a people's journey of capture and resistance, of hunger and survival, of joy wrung from scarcity, of abundance wrestled from oppression. Every dish is a memory, and every meal is a monument. Soul food is not just what we eat. It is who we are, and who we have insisted on being. From its beginnings in the fires of slavery, soul food has borne witness to the impossible. Enslaved Africans took scraps and transformed them into sustenance. They seasoned deprivation with creativity, turning waste into nourishment and pain into flavor. Each pot of greens simmered with patience. Each loaf of cornbread baked with care was a declaration. We will live. That insistence on life, even in the shadow of death, is the first flavor of soul food. As generations passed, the food evolved but never lost its core. It became the centerpiece of Sunday dinners, the taste of home for migrants in distant cities, the binding agent of family reunions and church gatherings. It became both ordinary and sacred everyday sustenance and holiday feast. Around the table, people remembered who they were and passed that memory forward. Recipes became a living archive, a library not written but tasted. Soul food is, above all, a record of resilience. To eat it is to inherit the creativity of ancestors, who found ways to make beans tender, to coax sweetness from yams, to craft fried chicken so crisp it became legend. But it is also to inherit their laughter, their songs, their prayers said over the table. It carries the sound of children running through kitchens, the hum of hymns on Sunday, the murmur of elders telling stories long into the evening. The taste is inseparable from the soundscape, the landscape, the lifescape of Black life in America. Yet, soul food does not belong only to the past. It is alive, changing, breathing with each generation. Today, it lives in vegan kitchens, in food trucks, in fine dining restaurants, in backyard barbecues, in college dorm microwaves, where a student reheats their grandmother's greens. It is carried forward by chefs with global followings and by quiet elders who still insist that no holiday is complete without their sweet potato pie. The cuisine adapts, just as the people adapt, but its essence remains. Survival, community, creativity, joy. At the heart of soul food lies a paradox. It is humble, yet grand. It is simple, yet complex. It carries the memory of hunger, but also the celebration of abundance. It is criticized as unhealthy, yet it embodies wellness in the deepest sense. Nourishment of spirit, affirmation of identity, connection across generations. To sit at a soul food table is to be reminded that health is not only measured in blood pressure and sugar levels, but in laughter, belonging, and joy. Authenticity, in the end, is not about whether greens are seasoned with pork or smoked paprika. It is not about whether macaroni and cheese is baked or boiled. Authenticity is about the spirit that animates the food. It is about the way the table gathers people, the way memory infuses flavor, the way history is honored in every bite. If soul food carries love, resilience, and continuity, it is authentic, no matter the form it takes. Perhaps this is the deepest truth. Soul food is freedom made edible. It is the freedom to take what was meant as refuse and make it delicious. The freedom to gather in defiance of a world that tried to scatter. The freedom to savor joy even when joy was rationed. The freedom to remember, to imagine, to create. Each meal is a small emancipation, a refusal to be defined by what was imposed. And in that freedom lies a gift to the world. Soul food is American food, global food and inheritance that has shaped national identity as surely as jazz or gospel. Its flavors have traveled across oceans. Its techniques have influenced countless cuisines. Yet even as it spreads, it remains rooted in the soil of Black life, in the hands that stirred pots, in cabins and kitchens, in the spirits that refused to give up. To taste soul food is to taste memory of fields and kitchens, of migrations and reunions, of hands passing bowls across crowded tables. It is to taste freedom, the freedom of survival, the freedom of joy, the freedom of self-definition. It is to taste the unbroken chain of resilience, stretching from ancestors to descendants, linking past to present, grief to celebration, struggle to triumph. So when we eat collard greens, let us taste the gardens of enslaved ancestors who claimed small plots as acts of resistance. When we bite into cornbread, let us remember the mingling of African, native, and European traditions that made something new from necessity. When we savor sweet potato pie, let us honor the ways harvest became hope. When we drink sweet tea, let us recall that even in bitterness, sweetness could be found. Soul food tells us that history is not only written in books, but carried in kitchens. It reminds us that survival is never the whole story. There is always joy, always creativity, always the possibility of abundance. It insists that food is not just fuel, but meaning, memory, and song. And so the feast continues. Around tables in every corner of the country, families still gather. Recipes are still taught, plates are still passed, laughter still rises, and prayers are still spoken. The archive grows, the tradition deepens, the story unfolds. Soul food is not finished. It never will be. It is always in the making, always in the tasting, always in the sharing. It is history you can eat, freedom you can savor, memory you can pass along with a fork. To eat soul food is to know we were here, we are here, and we will be here still. The taste endures, the memory endures, the freedom endures, forever seasoned, forever alive.